Chapter 3. My Grandmother, Ketty. My father started telling me about my grandmother when I was a child. She had a strong influence on his personality, and undoubtedly, Tom's most talented side owed much to his mother's influence. Through those memories and experiences stored in my unconscious, I was also forgetting my character and decisions. Today, I understand, better than ever, how much the immaterial inheritance of Ketty's example marked us both. San Francisco Bay, 1896. It is a cold, dark winter morning. In the crowd approaching the pier, Ketty and Jane, her mother, are walking hurriedly towards the boarding area. A few steps behind them are a couple of young boys carrying luggage. The steamship, Hamburg American Line Cruises, is about to set sail for South America. Its smokestacks belch smoke outward, merging with the fog in the bay, forming a cloud that slowly drifts away towards the horizon. At the gangway door, a handsome officer welcomes them. Some sailors carry large bundles and boxes full of groceries, as they will not touch land for several weeks. Ketty helps her mother up on deck. A commotion of children running among the bundles and passengers is heard. The steamer blows a thunderous whistle announcing that she's ready to sail. The first mate gives the order to weigh anchor and cast off. The ship begins to move out to sea, while both women make room for each other in the crowd standing at the rail, holding up their handkerchiefs. Ketty holds in her hands one embroidered with her initials, a gift from her aunt, Catherine. The young woman is thrilled to be making her first trip to her father's homeland, where her uncles and cousins are waiting for her, especially Manuel, with whom she has corresponded since childhood. However, she feels sad to be away from her beloved aunt, her mother's only sister, who has spoiled her since her birth and who has always considered her as a daughter she never had. At this moment, and although she was not on the dock, Ketty lifts the handkerchief and says goodbye to her, imagining her there. Ketty returns to the cabin where Jane is arranging the luggage and several of her favorite books that were, from an early age, her faithful companions. It is almost past noon when the captain's voice is heard over the loudspeaker welcoming the passengers, as well as the regulations on board. At dinner time, the first class went down to the dining room. It was an opulent room decorated with frescoes on the ceiling, walls covered with fine carved wood and fluffy Persian rugs. Each table was dressed with damask tablecloths and lit by small opaline chandeliers. Ketty and Jane are dazzled at the sight of such elegance, appreciating the quality of the tableware. In fact, the crockery was Royal Doulton, the cutlery by Wallace, and the glassware by the traditional house of Waterford. At dinner time, Ketty and her mother had to share a table with the Larraín Barros family, who were traveling with their young daughter, Alicia. They were returning to Chile after a long trip through Europe and the United States. They belonged to an elite of landowners who formed the Creole upper class and enjoyed great socioeconomic and political power. Alicia had been educated under the tutelage of a strict governess of British origin and then at the prestigious Santiago College, an American Methodist school. Since she was a child, she had traveled and learned from other traditions that broadened her perspective, forging in her an awareness of progress and vanguardism, especially in relation to women's rights. Although Jane and Ketty now belonged to an English-speaking country, they were fluent in Spanish from the time their state was part of Mexico. In fact, Jane was Mexican and Ketty was born in San Francisco only a few decades after 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe de Hidalgo, which ended the conflict between Mexico and the United States, incorporating the territory of California into the North American nation. It was as a result of his treaty that Jane acquired U.S. citizenship and all the civil rights it conferred. Ketty attended the Hamlin School for Girls, where she studied until she finished high school. After graduating, she dedicated herself to learning the typical household trades of the time, in addition to devoting much of her time to volunteer work in the Jesuit missions. Alicia and Ketty quickly felt a strong bond of friendship. The young woman would talk each evening about their life experiences as they watched the sunset. Ketty would tell Alicia about the great diversity of immigrants, especially Asians, who integrated into communities forming San Francisco's fascinating Chinatown, spreading their ancestral customs there. They were the ones who worked on the construction of the railroad tracks that fueled the nation's boom. Alicia, for her part, told her that she would enroll in the University of Chile to begin studying law, just as her heroine, Matilde Thrupp, the first Chilean woman to receive a law degree in 1892, had done. Regularly, the young ladies enjoyed dancing evenings in the lounge where the orchestra played fashionable tunes such as American ragtime or four-step, which they danced to with some of the traveling boys. During the day, if the weather was nice, they would gaze at the seascape or read while lying on the deck chairs with other guests. The friends were having a great experience. Ketty thought that Alicia embodied what she was looking for: determination to forge a life away from the stereotypes of the time that pigeonholed women into very limiting roles. They laughed, enjoyed themselves, and were also saddened to see how little time they had left together in this journey. Very early in the morning, the crew's bustle can be heard as the passengers get ready with their luggage to disembark. Dawn breaks. The sea is calm, and in the near distance, the port of Valparaíso with its picturesque hills can be seen. The captain carefully docks the steamer at the main dock, where a few seagulls flutter and squawk in welcome. The passengers hurry ashore, although Ketty and her mother are the last to do so, due to the effusive farewell of the young woman. Alicia handed her new friend an envelope with her hometown written on it, hoping to see her again. They hugged each other goodbye and wished each other the best, and said goodbye with their eyes until they lost sight of each other on the crowded dock. The girl took out of her pocket the photograph of her cousin Manuel, who was anxiously waiting for them. She looked through the crowd and spotted the young man in the portrait, who recognized her and raised his hand to make himself seen. As they approached each other, they were overcome with emotion. They finally met in person. They have had years of only communicating by correspondence, in which Manuel would tell her about his family and life in the countryside. He also wrote to her about the work they were doing, about the new vineyard plantations, and about his dreams of one day producing a good wine and putting a label with his name on each bottle. Manuel was optimistic, as Chilean wine was gaining prestige in the North American market. What he never imagined was that years later, the prohibition law would have a terrible impact on the commercialization of this product, putting an end to his dream. Ketty knows Chile through the memories of her father, who emigrated as a young man to the United States to finish his studies in literature. It was during this period that he met Jane, and after a short romance, they married, forming their home in San Francisco. Now, after 3 decades since José Escobar arrived in California, his daughter is returning to her father's homeland to reclaim the inheritance of her ancestors. Ketty planned to spend some time with her family to get to know the customs of this distant country and to return in the fall, which is the departure of the last steamer of the season. She does not yet know that fate has another trick in store for her. I don't know if all of this happened as it did. In my adolescence, I heard from Marita, the oldest of my cousins, who did not love my grandmother very much, that she came with a circus, where she acted as a trapeze artist dressed in a provocative costume of lights. She said that once a great Chilean businessman linked to the northern saltpeter mines, whose name I prefer to omit, went to the circus with his son and was struck by this intrepid blonde who swayed from end to end under the big top. He claimed that, struck by this woman's mesmerizing acrobatics, They became friends and eventually lovers. She recounted that he was always her wet blanket when her husband would leave her, and that, as a result, Bob's family ostracized her. She even said that the tourmaline necklace that my grandmother treasured so much was a gift from Mr. Eduardo. What's the truth? I don't know, because I never knew about these characters, but my other cousins, the Visors, hated Marita for spreading this aberrant gossip, and they insisted that my grandmother came from the north, just as Tom told me. However, already knowing this story, but still as a child, when my father would take us to the Human Eagle Circus, we would sit on the front row. And my favorite act was the trapeze artists soaring through the sky in their tulle and sequin dresses. I was so fascinated by watching them that I felt a longing to become one of them and travel in a caravan, dazzling the world with my show. So it doesn't seem so far-fetched to me that my grandmother would have come in a circus. Who knows? But besides being a trapeze artist, I also wanted to be a nun, a princess, and even a suicide. What I never thought was that I would be a writer. Chapter 4. Reception at the Hacienda. Manuel has arrived early at the port to meet them. Juan, the coachman, is waiting for them in a carriage drawn by 4 horses with a soft jet-colored coat. The man lifts the luggage into the back, while the host and his guest settle into the blue velvet seat. Juan, rein in hand, begins the hours-long journey that will take them to Los Álamos, the Vicuña Valdés family estate in Limache. The large house, nestled in a valley between hills, was built by his grandparents in adobe, a mixture of mud and straw, Manuel tells them. Adobe? Asked Ketty. Yes, this material is very common in northern and central Chile, he replies. Ketty tells him that her mother was born in a similar house, on land that formerly belonged to Mexico. The Vicuña house would remind her of it, with its long corridors, poplar beams, felled from the same field, and brick floors. The conversation becomes pleasant as the carriage drives along dusty roads. On the sides, there are vineyards, wheat plantations, and expanses of white and pink fruit trees in bloom, contrasting with the light blue sky. It's time to rest, says the coachman, stopping at the side of the road, a few steps from a stream where the horses dip their snouts to quench their thirst. Juan hands Manuel the wicker basket that Micaela, the maid, prepared for the road. He takes out the kneaded bread, spreads them with butter, and serves them to Manuel along with a comforting coffee. "This is good!" exclaims Ketty, tasting that piece of firewood-flavored bread. They stretch their legs and return to the car to continue the last stretch to the house, where the whole family is waiting for them. The preparations began weeks ago. The beds in the bedroom were made up with impeccable sheets, embroidered by the nuns of the Carmelite convent. Nothing was missing in the room. On top of the hairdresser, there was a beautiful earthenware washstand with its water pitcher, the soap dish and a matching box for the hairpins. A couple of white towels hung on the sides. At the foot of each bronze cot, there was a brazier for the cold nights. In a corner of the room was the walnut closet with a shiny beveled mirror. In the kitchen, they prepared empanadas made in the mud oven, turkey casserole with a ground corn and fruits in syrup from the last harvest. These delicacies were to be savored with the best wine of the season, produced by the vineyard. Aunt Inés dressed the table with a tablecloth that she had made with her own hands and put on the porcelain soup tureen that her mother used on great occasions, brought from Spain. When the carriage was arriving at its destination, the dogs came out barking to greet their master and guest. Micaela from the kitchen commented, "I'm going to take a look outside to see how this master's visits are." The horses can already be heard galloping and neighing as they feel the brakes on the reins. Aunt Inés comes out to the corridor to embrace her niece and sister-in-law, whom she had never seen before. "Welcome to Chile," he says, effusively. Ketty answers with great excitement. Thank you. We're happy to be here. Chapter 5. Jim's maternal grandfather. Joaquín Sáenz Escribano was born in 1889 in Viloslada de Cameros, La Rioja, Spain, into a farming family. In 1909, there is a climate of unrest and attacks on the Maura government with social upheavals on the part of the anarchists. Joaco, as he was known, since he was a child, is 20 years old and is called to the militia, but he refuses, because he has other plans. This is how he decides to emigrate, with a couple of pesetas in his pocket, full of dreams and desire to succeed, embarking for South America. Joaco is a smart and entrepreneurial boy, willing to cooperate in whatever was necessary, motivated by the demanding work he was used to in the field. He soon wins the friendship of the crew for his cheerful character and sense of humor. When he walks on deck, he always sings a song from his land and greets both passengers and crew. Occasionally, he engages in pleasant conversations with sailors who have previously been to Chile, as the route has become a sought-after destination for Europeans seeking new opportunities. During these get-togethers, Joaco learned about some Chilean customs and the natural beauties of the south of the country, such as the impressive volcanoes, the extensive lakes at their feet, and the dense native forest that surrounds them. Thus, his desire to settle down and form his new life in these fascinating places was born. Upon arrival, the young man heads to the capital to connect with a train of the south track of Ferrocarriles del Estado that will take him directly to this area. As soon as he begins to glimpse the green forest landscape and lush mountains, he falls in love with the place and settles in Vilcún, Araucanía region. There, the Mapuche territory was transformed from some cattle-raising economy to an agricultural and timber exploitation one. Joaco, who was very ambitious and hard-working, took advantage of the colonization boom and acquired a small plot of land, which he worked hard to turn into a prosperous sawmill. He would never have imagined that, in time, this adventure, which he began at the age of 20, would turn him into a great landowner and eventually into the largest supplier of timber for El Teniente copper mine. Those lands also offered him another gift, to meet Maria Emma, daughter of a Spanish emigrant that had settled in the south years before. When Joaco began to work the land, he consulted with other compatriots, one of them being the father of Maria Emma, who soon became his wife, and mother of his only daughter. Birth of Emma. October 12, 1917 is a complicated morning. Maria Emma began having contractions the night before. In the early morning, Joaquín asked one of his employees to bring out the midwife. While waiting for her, he nervously goes in and out of the room, walking up and down the stairs while smoking a cigar. On the second floor, in the master bedroom, his wife is about to give birth. She moans and writhes in pain while two maids, one on each side of the bed, revive her with cold cloths on her forehead and console her, saying, "Juana is coming to assist you, Missy Amita." The woman is on the verge of fainting, as it had been 6 hours since labor began. Finally, the sound of someone climbing the stairs can be heard. It is the midwife, who enters the room urgently, and after verifying the seriousness of the woman in labor, orders, "Bring hot towels. Help me get her settled. Her head is sticking out." The maids run to prepare everything they need. They know that Juana is the best midwife in the area and do not hesitate to obey her instructions. Meanwhile, she squeezes Maria Emma's belly, who feels a violent tearing, pushes hard, and expels a baby. The woman receives her, cleans her, and wraps her in a blanket to place her in the arms of her father, who waits in shock at the threshold of the room. The midwife continues her work, trying to control the hemorrhage and reduce the fever of the woman, who is getting weaker and weaker. Despite her best efforts, little could be done, and as night fell, her eyes would close forever. The employer's devastation at the loss of his wife cannot be expressed in words. He locks himself in a room and weeps bitterly. At times, he wishes he had gone with her, for he does not know how he will cope with raising the child alone. However, she will end up being his consolation and mooring to life. The oldest employee tells him that the Mapuche woman who washes the clothes in the house, the wife of Jacinto, the man in charge of the corrals, has just given birth and could take care of the child. After a 2-day wake, the funeral procession, composed of sawmill employees, some servants, and a few friends, led by the young widower and the family of the deceased, left for the cemetery to bury the deceased mother. A pair of white wreaths adorned the coffin. The parish priest of the community offered the religious responsories according to the Catholic tradition. Joaquin went to and swallowed his tears with great difficulty. They had met shortly after her arrival in the community, and she was his loyal companion. On his return home, he went up to his bedroom, opened the closet, and looked in dismay at his beloved clothes. On the comb, he gazed with emotion at a portrait of their wedding. He laid on his bed, sobbing until he fell asleep. The following week, he christened his daughter Emma, in honor of her mother. Joaquin took refuge in work to alleviate his loneliness, while Emita grew strong and healthy with the care of the maids and the Mapuche who fed her until she was 1 year old. Her father would see her in the afternoons when he returned from the fields. The sawmills, little by little, became large facilities, extending their lucrative heritage. Emma was a beautiful little girl with golden hair and big blue eyes, who spent her days clinging to the skirts of her nanny, who spoiled her in everything. In the mornings, she collected eggs, fed the little chicks, and played with the rabbits they raised on the farm. While Melania, the cook, kneaded the bread, Emma put her little hands in the dough and made a couple of rolls especially for her and her father. It was during this time that she learned household chores, such as making jams, cooking delicious casseroles, humitas, empanadas, and other country delicacies. In addition, she was taught to knit and embroider, which every young girl should know before getting married. When she turned 10 years old, Joaquin took her to Temuco to board her at the school for young ladies of the Order of the Carmelitas Descalzas, since he wanted the best education for her. The girl was sad to be away from her beloved father, but the nuns welcomed her with a very special affections because she was a motherless girl, and because of the great generosity of Don Joaquin towards the convent.